The world's eyes are on India at the moment, with the country getting set to host the big G20 Leaders Summit in a few days' time. The Modi government is going all out to make the G20 summit a grand success. But how does the international community view India's G20 and our country's place in the world? To talk about all the hot-button global issues of the moment, I am delighted to be joined live and exclusive on India Today by one of the world's top foreign affairs gurus, Fareed Zakaria. Fareed, welcome back. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us.
Great to talk to you, Rahul, as always.
Fareed, last week I was part of an interview with Prime Minister Modi for Business Today's special issue on the G20. And one of the key headlines was that the Prime Minister saw India's G20 as a catalyst for the emergence of a new world order. Do you really see a new world order emerge over the next few years, with India playing a far more important role than it has in the recent past?
There is certainly that possibility, but I don't think it's a guarantee. Look, the old order is changing. You cannot have a world order which was as dominated by the West as we have had for the last 75 years. But the new order is still coming into being, and there are a few key questions that people are trying to figure out about this new order. First, who will be part of it? Who will be the leading powers in that system? Will it be all the major powers of the world, or will it be the major powers of the world that share some values and some interests? And relatedly, what is the world order about? Is it just about management of problems, dealing with issues of trade or customs unions? Or is there an aspiration to try to make it, lead to a more rule-based world, a world in which there are greater norms, there are values? This has been a tension at the heart of the construction of a world order ever since 1945. So the United States sets up this rules-based international system. The Soviet Union basically kind of defected. And so for 40 or 50 years, you had a group of countries, mostly the West, but some others as well, participating in that. Then it opened up to almost everybody. Now it seems to be closing down again, with Russia and China trying to find their own path. So there are two issues here. One, will India be able to play that role? And does it have both the hard power, but also the soft power, the ideas, the agenda? And then secondly, what is that agenda? What are we trying? What is India trying to do? What is it trying to? What kind of a world is it trying to help construct?
At the India at 100 summit, I interviewed someone you know well, Borge Brande, the president of the World Economic Forum, who said that in the next 10 years, the World Economic Forum sees India becoming a $10 trillion economy, and the new world order, which we just spoke about, being defined by what he called the G3, the US, China, and India. Do you think that this is the inevitable direction in which things are heading, that this G3 then determines the rules of engagement in this new world order, or do you think it's a bit premature to just come to the conclusion that there indeed will be a G3 in that order?
Well, there's no chance that there will be a G3. I have great respect for Borge. He's a friend, but it makes no sense. The United States and China are not going to create some kind of condominium in which they agree to run the world. That possibility is long gone, and India will not be joining it. Look, this is one of the reasons I described the world when I started to think about how these changes were taking place as a post-American world. Because really, the truth is, it's a much messier world than what that implies. The G3 suggests some kind of order, these three big powers setting the agenda, everyone else quietly listening. That's not going to happen. First of all, the US and China can't agree on anything right now. Secondly, Europe is a huge player. Europe is still, remember, 25% of global GDP. It has enormous soft power in terms of the ideas it has, the foreign aid it gives. It's also cohering now in the face of both Russian aggression, but also the Chinese challenge. Japan is not going to sit quietly by. So the truth of the matter is, the world we're in is one where even the middle powers, Turkey, Brazil, Indonesia, think they have a voice, think they have a stake, and that they deserve to be represented at the table. That's why I think Prime Minister Modi's point about the G20 is very well taken. The G20 is the kind of organization that could reflect this new post-American world because it's large enough to take into account, the countries that are not first-tier powers but are still not going to be simply pawns on somebody's chessboard. Saudi Arabia is not going to quietly follow Washington's diktats anymore. But it's not going to follow Beijing's diktats anymore. And it's not going to follow New Delhi's diktats. So we have to capture a framework and an institutional structure that reflects the reality that everyone wants to be heard and represented. And that's why you're going to have a wider grouping than you had in the UN Security Council, for example, which was just 5 countries.
We've seen over the past few days an announcement that BRICS would be expanded to include Argentina, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE. Some of these countries are philosophically at odds with each other, Iran, Saudi Arabia for one. How do you see this play out? India is a member of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, also a member of BRICS, at the same time a part of the Quad, whereas the core philosophies and objectives of some of these multilateral bodies are actually quite different from each other. And India at this moment wanting to have its foot on both stools, can that continue, or do you think it's inevitable that you'll have to pick one stool?
Look, there's enough goodwill toward India. India is powerful enough, and it's crucial enough in terms of the nature of the new geopolitics because of the rise of China, that it can, to a certain extent, have its cake and eat it too. But it needs to think through what is strategically the best for India. So something like BRICS is really a kind of nonsense organization, if I can be honest. I mean, the term comes out of a Goldman Sachs economist who predicted that these were going to be the powerhouse economies of the future, which, by the way, has turned out to be completely untrue. The second letter in BRICS is Russia. Russia is in free fall, economically, demographically, technologically. So the idea that you're going to have a new world order, that is going to be defined by Russian power seems to me really, really unlikely. Then, as you say, it's been expanded now to include countries that are, not only have very different views, but some of which are very pro-American, the Gulf states, some of them, like China, are trying to turn it into an anti-American organization. I don't think it will go anywhere. I think the idea that you would have a common currency out of the BRICS is completely fanciful. It's not going to happen. So what India needs to ask itself is, what is its basic core strategic objective? And I would argue India's core strategic objective should be to align itself with the leading powers in the world that are also democratic, that are also value-based. Because not only will that give India the biggest economic boost, India has to choose, in a sense, at least technologically, which sphere it's going to be part of, the Chinese sphere or the US sphere. And it's already chosen. It's chosen the US sphere. India is going to have to choose in terms of its broader industrial base, where it is orienting itself, where it's going to have supply chains. And it is already choosing to be part of the democratic world, the free world, the world of, kind of rule of law, etc. So if that's the case, it is going to get much greater benefits if it aligns itself clearly and coherently and consistently in that direction, while, of course, maintaining very good relations with China. Look, the US has a $700 billion trade relationship with China. Nobody is asking India to choose in those terms. India needs to have a strong economic relationship with China. But I think that one of the reasons that there's so much goodwill toward India in the world is because there's a sense that this is a rising power coming out of Asia, representing the aspirations of 1.4 billion people, but also one that has historically espoused universal values, human rights, democracy. This is not irrelevant to India's appeal. And so it should capitalize on that. And as I say, from a purely self-interested point of view, if you had to choose one technology ally in the world, the US or China, it seems to me the contest is pretty clear. The US is the absolute dominant country. And the US has enormous goodwill toward India. And there is going to be, I believe, a real kind of tech corridor between India and the U.S., just as there is, for example, between the U.S. and Israel, the U.S. and Western Europe. So there's a big potential for India, but it does need to clarify strategically where it wants to go.
There are multiple reports that have come out nationally and internationally, Farid, that talk about India becoming the third largest economy in the world. Some suggest that this could happen by 2027, others say it could happen by 2030, but the direction and the trend seems inevitable. Does that then also make India the third most important country in the world in a few years from now? Or do you think just because you are the third largest economy doesn't necessarily make you the third most important country, because Japan at the moment is at number 3, Germany at 4, and that's not really how you equate national comprehensive power, because Japan isn't really the third most important country in the world.
Yeah, I mean, you answered your own question, Rahul. That's exactly right. It's not just power is a complicated thing. It's not just hard power, economic power. It's not just military power. It's also soft power. It's your agenda-setting capacity. It's the ideas you have. Do you propose ideas to the world that are attractive to them? I would argue that for all its flaws, and God knows there are many, and I've been a critic for many occasions, the U.S. has been able to play this role of the world's leading power because it has always tried to formulate ideas that were in a broader interest of the world and represented some values. So setting up the United Nations, when U.S. was 50% of global GDP, right? This is constraining American power. Setting up all these international organizations, all these areas where there's one person or one country, one vote, where the U.S.'s enormous economic or military dominance does not give it special advantages. That's part of the reason why the U.S. has been able to be such an effective agenda setter. So I believe that India has that same potential. I don't think China does. Nobody believes in the Chinese dream. The Chinese are much more power focused. They are focused on enhancing Chinese power, and that's it. That's it. But India could aspire to a broader role. So I do think that is a possibility. It's very much within India's grasp. First, it has to grow economically. I think that let's not count our chickens before they're hatched.
But linked to the question of economic growth is the political debate around whether what the Congress calls the inevitability of India's economic trajectory versus the BJP's assertion that this is linked to political stability, and the existence of a strong government is one of the key reasons why the image around India is changing globally, and therefore that then becomes a hugely contested idea ahead of next year's elections. Where do you come out on that, Farid?
Look, nothing is inevitable. Look at what's happening to China right now. Look at what happened to Japan after 40 years of heady economic growth. You have to persist. You have to continue to reform. You have to execute. India has done a lot in the last 20 years under governments of both political coalitions. But there's a lot to do. I mean, now, for example, there's a great deal of talk about India becoming the new manufacturer and replacing, the China. It's going to be very hard because India remains very protectionist. One of the reasons China was able to be the manufacturing hub of the world is that it was able to take in intermediate goods from all over the world. So people say the iPhone is made in China. It's not really made in China. It's made in 16 Asian countries. And the parts go back and forth, and it's finally assembled in China. But in order to do that, you have to have relatively open trade. India has very high protectionist barriers in many of these areas. So it has to figure out if it's going to try to play this role of a market leader, it needs to also get more comfortable with opening up the economy. There are still, as you know, in India, crazy tariffs, 100, 200, 300% tariffs. So part of what India needs to do is to recognize that it is moving into a new world. It has this possibility to play this much larger role and double down on the things that need to happen, double down on good governance. And again, as I said, there has been much progress. I don't want to sound like I'm suggesting otherwise, but there's still a way to go.
One of the Prime Minister's big ideas during his G20 presidency has been for India to emerge as the voice of the global South. Now, this is an area where China has made a lot of effort in the decades gone by in Africa, in South America, elsewhere, to try and establish itself as the natural leader of the global South. Do you see the inevitability of this contest, the effort made by India to now emerge as the voice of the global South, the Prime Minister pushing for the African Union to be given permanent membership of the G20 as part of that idea, versus China imagining that Africa and other parts of the global South are its natural domain?
It's a very good example of this issue of hard power versus soft power and ideas. So the Chinese are basically going to approach this from the point of view that says, we, China, are able to provide all kinds of goodies to the global South. We are building out infrastructure in Africa. We are building infrastructure in Asia, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, and places like that. And as a result, we are the natural allies and representatives of the global South. India does not have that kind of financial capacity. It is not going to, it cannot match China. Just to remind your viewers, China is still, in economic terms, 5 times larger than India. But India can compete in the realm of ideas, in the realm of soft power, in the realm of thinking about what ideas, what values these third world countries, these developing nations want, and representing them with greater force. And again, that's why I think, particularly because in so many of these countries, if you think about South Africa, Kenya, Indonesia, Brazil, so many of these developing countries are now democracies. And there is something that they share in terms of wanting a world in which there is a greater degree of rules, norms, and even values represented. So that's why I think India can't abandon that element of its DNA. And why should it? But just from a completely self-centered point of view, this is one of its most effective weapons. This is one of its most effective powers that it has, unlike China, which cannot do that. China has a very different system than South Africa, Kenya, Indonesia, Brazil, or India.
You know, Reuters is reporting that Xi Jinping may not come to India for the G20 summit. While that isn't final, the Chinese Foreign Ministry didn't answer that question. Efforts still on to ensure that Xi comes, even if it's for just a day. If Xi indeed decides, Fareed, not to come to Delhi, what would you attribute this to? Is it because of the tension between India and China on the border? Is it because of China's current economic turmoil, or something else? Given the fact that China has been very keen to show itself as a key player at multilateral bodies like the G20, and Xi and the Chinese leadership haven't missed a single G20 summit so far.
You're right to pick up on this, Rahul. It's very significant. If Xi chooses not to come, it sends a very interesting signal. And I'm not sure whether this is intended, but it certainly would seem like this. The Chinese are trying to decide under Xi what their orientation is towards the basic issue, of are they trying to integrate into the world? Are they trying to be part of a rules-based international system? Or like the Russians, are they trying to be in opposition to what would be seen as a US-led system or a Western-led system? Under the old regime in China, that is, before Xi, there was no question that the Chinese were trying to be part of that system, and they wanted more power and influence within it. So they were, they had stepped up and were funding peacekeeping operations all over the world. They became the second largest contributor to the United Nations. They became key figures in almost all the UN agencies. They were, of course, a huge part of the WTO. Maybe there is some rethinking about whether China under Xi should be playing a different kind of role, setting itself up, against those bodies, because they are all Western dominated or certainly Western created. And then there's the second issue, which you also raised, which is it is a real slap in the face to India and to the Prime Minister himself, who has made this summit very important. And it tells me that for all that the Chinese have said that they want to get better relations with India, they want to solve the border dispute, they really don't. Remember, they have, over the last 20 years, they have had 16 border disputes with their neighbors. They have resolved 15 of them, mostly. The one country they have not resolved it with is India. So there's something going on there where there is a degree of competitiveness or neuralgia about, certainly at least that border, maybe because it involves Tibet. But there's something here where they are not trying to move forward and resolve the tensions with India. And this would certainly add to that feeling that they are not trying to kind of effect a rapprochement, because this is a big deal for India. This is a big deal for Prime Minister Modi personally, and for Xi to snub him that way it's a very powerful signal.
You know, all reports from China suggest that the economy is far worse off than the mandarins in Beijing would want the world to believe. How does this growing economic stress, in your view, impact Xi's decision-making on the national and international arena?
It's a very good question, Rahul. I think anyone who tells you they have a clean answer for that is not being honest. We don't know. Look, firstly, the Chinese economy is in real trouble. I've been writing about this for a while and saying this for a while. I think now people might be exaggerating. I mean, now I'm hearing people talk about China collapse. But what's really significant about it is it makes you realize that at the core of what is happening in China is that the people don't trust their government. So the most significant statistic I've seen about the Chinese economy is that in the last 5 or 7 years, household savings have gone up 50%. In other words, people are putting their money in savings accounts. Effectively, they're hiding it in mattresses. Why? Because they don't believe the government will be able to handle the real estate situation. They don't believe that government will be able to handle the debt overhang. And most importantly, they don't believe the government is being honest with them. So the Chinese have done something quite remarkable for a major economy. They've stopped providing data because they know that the data is going to look very bad. And so they've just stopped providing economic data in many key areas. And that's, that once you scare the psychologically people, consumers, investors, entrepreneurs, can you get it back? This is where it's different from Japan in the 90s. Japan in the 90s was having policy problems. Japanese government didn't know how to handle them. But Japan was not an opaque dictatorship. And so this is the part we have to look at. Now, will it lead China to moderate its foreign policy, or will it lead it to say we need to gin up some nationalism, where we're losing the legitimacy we had because of economic growth, and as a result, we're going to, saber rattle over Taiwan. You've seen countries do both, so it's difficult to tell, and particularly in a system where decision-making is largely made by one person, it's very hard to say in general what would happen. I mean, if you look in the broad sweep of history, when you become less powerful, you become less active on the world stage. Britain and France became less active, but less powerful in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and they withdrew from their empires. Now, they in some cases withdrew kicking and screaming, and there was a fair amount of turmoil in places like Vietnam and Algeria. But they eventually became less important as world players. I think you can't say with Xi where he will go, because really more than anywhere, maybe since Mao, we have not seen a Chinese leader with this much consolidated power. And so we're all trying to read the tea leaves of this one man.
There's a big debate in international think tank circles about whether China is now a declining power. The fundamental idea that rising powers can afford to bide their time, but declining powers are tempted to take their chances. President Biden said recently, when bad folks have problems, they do bad things. As China's economic fortunes wobble, do the risks to Taiwan grow in your view?
I think they probably do. Again, as I say, it's a little hard to tell, and I'm not sure that I would describe China quite yet as a declining power. I think it's more likely to plateau. It's likely to, China is already very powerful. It is the second largest economy in the world by far, larger than the number 3 and number 4 put together. It has a huge military that has been building for the last 25 years. It has a veto in the Security Council. None of that is going to disappear. even if China moderates its growth to say 4% or something like that. But it does seem that the enormous power it gained from, for example, having these massive surpluses, from being able to be the importer of all the world's commodities, the largest trading partner of all countries, all that may begin to wane. And so then the question is, does it begin to think it has a window of opportunity with Taiwan that will be foreclosed? Look, I think this a lot depends here on how the world reacts. And I think that the Biden administration deserves a lot of credit for having put together very quietly, but very firmly, a kind of deterrence policy. Whether you look at the Quad, whether you look at the recent summit with Japan and Korea, if you look at the talks the U.S. has had with the Philippines to be able to do more with their military, these are all building blocks that are just saying to the Chinese, there would be a heavy price to pay. And looking at what the price Russia has paid, I'm sure Beijing understands that it would be a seismic event if it were to invade Taiwan. And it would trigger a series of sanctions and things like that that would be very painful. So I think the best you can do in this situation is not try to predict which way it'll go, but to try and put in place building blocks that give the Chinese every incentive to do what they've done for the last 75 years, which is kick the can down the road. Sometimes in diplomacy, there's no point in trying to solve the problem. There is a status quo that everyone can live with, and just let it keep going, which is better than any effort to resolve it, because any effort to resolve it raises existential issues for both China and Taiwan.
Youth unemployment was north of 21% in June, and then the Xi government decided not to publish employment data anymore. It's the youth who led the Tiananmen protests in 1989. As the economic woes and the uncertainty for the younger generation grows, does it increase the chances of more Tiananmen-style protests?
Yes, I think one of the myths about China is that the U.S. tried to engage with China and thinking that as it became more of a market economy and more integrated, its politics would change, and nothing happened. This isn't exactly right. First of all, the U.S. largely engaged with China to integrate it into the world, and if you remember, in the 1970s, this was the world's largest rogue state. Mao was funding revolutions all over the world. But if there was a hope and an aspiration, it was that as China becomes more of a middle-class society, more integrated into the world economy, its people would want greater voice in some way, and the system would become more open and pluralistic in the way that has happened in Taiwan, in South Korea, in Hong Kong, in Malaysia. In so much of East Asia has gone through this same process. I think what happened here was that Xi realized that things were moving in that direction and decided to clamp down very tightly. Xi recognizes precisely that as you create a more middle-class society, you get more demands and more of people wanting more of a voice. And so he's been shutting it down across the board. He's cracking down on the private sector, on NGOs, on any kind of open media there was. Will he succeed? In the long run, I still tend to think you cannot have 500-600 million people who are in some way educated and middle class and give them absolutely nothing in terms of their participation in the political life of their country. It just feels like that is going to be a very hard balancing act to pull off. And it's precisely in moments like these, when you have downturns, when you have crises, when people feel, wait, we need some voice in this. We don't want one guy or 10 people in Beijing making every decision for us. So I mean, you call me naive, but I tend to still believe that the power, the desire of people to have a bit of a say in their political life is a universal one. And people who say it's Chinese culture is different, I say to them, go to Taiwan. Taiwan is as Chinese as China is culturally, but it is, by most rankings today, it is Asia's most consolidated liberal democracy.
Sure. For a moment, let's pivot from China to Russia now that Yevgeny Prigozhin is dead. Is the threat to Vladimir Putin's reign over? Is there still the prospects of another Prigozhin-style insurrection? How do you see the Russia story play out from here?
I think Putin is pretty strong. I have never believed the view that you could foment some kind of a crack in that regime. He has spent 21 years building what he calls the vertical of power. There is no opposition to him within the political system in Russia. There is no opposition within the state. This is the product of frankly, a kind of mistake that Putin made. Putin wanted to get some dirty jobs done in Africa, in Syria, and he realized that it was easier than using the Russian army, which creates all kinds of issues of state-to-state involvement. Is the Russian army involved in Africa? This was a kind of a simpler way to do it. This was a way of using your own commandos, and you had plausible deniability. You could say, what are you talking about? These are not Russian soldiers. I have no control over them. That's what he did in Ukraine. Remember in 2014, where he said these were just volunteers who went in and took Crimea. And then the operation got out of his control because Prigozhin, has a big ego. He was doing fantastically. He was raking in hundreds of millions of dollars, and then he in a sense got too big for his boots, and Putin had to rein him in. And Putin reined him in the traditional way Putin has reined in every opponent of his, by killing him. So I don't see this as suggesting some great crack within the Russian regime. It reminds you that Putin maintains his power through a very brutal application of force and power. But I don't see that as therefore resulting in any unravel.
Are we any closer, Farid, to some kind of end to the Russia-Ukraine war, or do you see this go on for months and years from here on?
I think we're further away than we were, because I think there was a hope that Ukraine would do better in this counteroffensive, put more pressure on Russia, and it's proving very hard. The Russians have dug in. The Russian army has learned from its mistakes. And remember, Russia is a huge country. It's 10 times the size of Ukraine. And as something I've been worried about from the start is that at the end of the day, the Russians have one thing historically, which is staying power. They stay with stuff for a long time. But the Ukrainians have that staying power too. They're not about to surrender, all of which tells you this is a stalemate that's going to go on for a long time.
I want to spend a moment on what's happening in America. Prime Minister Modi and American President Joe Biden will be meeting in a bilateral on the 8th of September. This is President Biden's first visit to India. What do you see happen in that meeting, coming as it does on the back of Prime Minister Modi's state visit to the US? And also, how do you see the build-up to the US presidential elections shaping up from here? Are we building up to a Biden versus Trump contest?
First, on the US-India part, look, at this point, you've had really 4 administrations of the US reach out to India in very significant ways. There is a kind of broad strategic decision that the United States has made to get closer to India and to partner with India. And that is not going to change. That is something both parties agree on. There's very little dissent from that policy. The Biden people have been executing that policy very well. Modi has been very receptive. So I don't think there's any danger of any diminution of the US-India partnership or ties, however you want to describe it. There is this danger of just what happens in the US. We think about political instability all over the world. Unfortunately, the place we have to think about it these days is in the United States. Look, we're in a worrying situation because, as you said, the most likely matchup is Trump versus Biden again. Trump is just too strong to be denied the nomination. He's 30, 40 points ahead of any rival. And that means there are one of two possibilities. Either he's going to win, Donald Trump will win the presidency, and that creates its own complications and crises because it really will be a revenge presidency and it will be Trump unleashed in various ways. or he will claim he won the election and create a huge political and constitutional crisis. I think there's no other alternative. The idea that Trump, this time around, when he loses, if he loses, will quietly accept the results when he did the last time around. I think people are hoping for somebody, for some change in this man, which is not likely to happen. So, which is to say, we are heading towards a political crisis in America, either a second Trump presidency or a highly contested election in which Trump claims that he has won and he will have more allies because they got rid of a lot of the state officials who stood up to him the last time around. I mean, I still don't think he'll prevail, but it could be, buckle your seatbelts. It could be a hell of a ride.
In the midst of all this ride, there's the rising star who's being tracked quite closely in India, Vivek Ramaswamy. He was nowhere, just seen as a talk show talking head. From there, he seems to have made some strides. Is he likely to be Trump's running mate? And what are you making of the young man and his politics?
I think he's very bright. He's very smart. He's very shrewd. He's figured out what the sort of DNA of the base of the Republican Party is. This very anti-establishment, anti-elitist, highly suspicious view that sees the government as fundamentally corrupt, broken, floats conspiracy theories. I think this is all highly calculated. I very much doubt that it comes from core convictions, honestly. But it's very effective because that is where the Republican Party's base is. And you can see it in the fact that the further he goes down that path, the more traction he gets. His basic problem is that if you believe in all that, Trump is the real thing. Everybody else, Vivek included, are just pale carbon copies. So why wouldn't you go for the real thing? And he just doesn't have a good answer for that. My own sense is that he's really biding his time and setting himself up as the kind of inheritor of the post-Trump period. I doubt very much that Trump would choose him as a vice president. I may be wrong. I think.
Why is that? Could he be the first Indian American to be president of the United States a few years from now?
It's possible. It's certainly possible. The reason I say it's unlikely is if I were advising Trump, his biggest problem right now is with women, particularly college-educated women. I would advise him to choose Nikki Haley as his running mate because that helps him with that crucial demographic. Remember, the craziness of the American election, Rahul, is the most powerful man in the world is going to be decided not by the American people. Biden won by 7 million votes the last time. He'll win by 8 or 9 this time because the demographics get worse for the Republicans every 4 years. It's going to be decided in 4 states: Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia. And in those 4 states, take Georgia, for example, Atlanta is going to vote blue. The rural areas are going to vote red. That is, the Atlanta will vote for Biden. The rural areas will vote for Trump. The small number of maybe 10 counties that are what we call the exurbs, one level further than the suburbs of Atlanta, will probably be the deciding factor. And within those exurbs, it will be working women who will probably be the deciding factor. Because everybody else has decided what they're going to do.
But the thing about that is, you're saying if Trump were to take your advice, if only he were taking advice from smart, intelligent people, maybe he wouldn't be doing a lot of what he's doing, but that's another story altogether.
Yeah, so look, all I'm telling you is the rational thing for him to do is to try to affect that small number of working women in those exurbs, in the 4 states that matter. And Vivek doesn't get him anything with those, whereas Nikki Haley does. She's Southern, so she can have an effect in Georgia. A lot of these people are, in a way, they like Southern politicians. Vivek has managed to do something that Trump himself has been able to do. A multi-millionaire entrepreneur who is, as part of the elite as anybody. I mean, the guy went to Harvard. He was, venture capital, biotech. These are not exactly, rural industries. Has managed to present himself as a tribune of the white working class. which is, partly Trump's genius. How did this billionaire real estate developer get to do that? So the two tribunes of the white working class in America both are, in one case, a billionaire, in another case, was worth almost $1 billion. It's very strange.
And both make for good copy. Fareed, I started by asking you about G20, and I want to end this interaction by going back to the big G20 summit. When we asked the Prime Minister about the Russia-Ukraine conflict in that Business Today interview, he sought to make the point that that's not the only issue in the world. There is so much more. The G20 was set up as an economic forum to deal with the financial crisis, to deal with issues of the global south, he says, reforming multilateral development banks, sustainable development goals, and therefore it can't come down to just what's happening between Russia and Ukraine. We've seen now, though, the German G20 Sherpa and many others in other countries might be thinking along similar lines, saying you can't have a G20 summit and not focus on Russia, Ukraine, which really is the biggest issue at this moment. How do you see this play out between India wanting to steer the conversation towards economic issues and countries like Germany and others which are most directly impacted by the Russia-Ukraine war wanting Russia-Ukraine to be central to the discussions, given that there cannot be any agreement on the language of a communique if it has too much of Russia-Ukraine in it?
This gets back to the issue we were talking about, which is India wanting to, on the one hand, be a global leader, but on the other hand, wanting to sort of fudge some of these issues that are about values, norms, rules. I don't see how you can be a leader if you're not willing to push in a certain direction. We have a vision for the world, not just nakedly pursue your self-interest. If India just wants to nakedly pursue its self-interest, fine, but other countries are going to say, why do we have to follow you? And I think that this is the Russia-Ukraine issue is the elephant in the room right now. You can talk about reforming, the trade rules and WTO and UNESCO and UNICEF, but right now what the world is confronting is the most blatant example of cross-border aggression since World War II. It is the largest land war in Europe since World War II. The borders have not changed by force very much since 1945. That rule, that norm has been upheld remarkably well in the world. And so this represents a massive violation of the basic ordering of the world since 1945. Does India really want to fudge the issue, to not deal with it, to avoid it? And I think that there's a way to, that was done in the last G20 of having a communique that in some ways reflects this concern. But doesn't get paralyzed by it. That's what effective diplomacy comes to, and it's not just a German issue, Rahul. That is, I would recommend to you and to Prime Minister Modi and to your viewers the speech that the Kenyan representative to the United Nations made after the Russian invasion, in explaining why Kenya voted to condemn it. He said, "Look at us, all of us developing countries. We all have inherited borders we don't agree with. These were colonial borders. These were borders drawn by people who had no knowledge of our countries. And they cut through tribes and religions and linguistic groups. But we have all come to the view that we are not going to try to forcibly alter these lines in the ground. We're going to live with them. We're going to have amicable relations with our neighbors. We're going to try to sort through whatever issues that come up by and the reason is, if we were to try to undo these, you would have, dozens of wars all over the world. And that's that sense that really international order rests on the idea that you cannot in 2023 view the world as one where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Thucydides' famous line. It has to be a world with a greater sense of purpose, of vision, of values, and that's always been India's DNA. It's always been India's one of India's superpowers is that it's not just another country. It is the world's greatest experiment in multicultural democracy, and has managed to do it in conditions of extreme poverty, which almost no country in the world was able to do. and it's managed to do it for 75 years. So, I mean, I think it's worth keeping in mind what the potential India has to offer in this kind of a world.
I hope you've been tracking the Chandrayaan mission to the moon. Lots of enthusiasm here, Farid, in India about being the 4th country to land, soft landing on the moon, and also the first to do so on the south pole of the moon.
Oh, it's amazing. And what's most amazing about it is the cost at which it was done. I mean, this is where, when you think about Indian innovation, if you look at the budgets of the 4 countries that have managed to do it, India is in an order of magnitude lower and was able to do a perfect landing and was able to learn from the mistakes of Chandrayaan-2. So there, I think, is exactly where the ingenuity of Indians, and we know this, if you look at how Indians are. I remember when I was growing up in India, when the car broke or a TV broke or something, you'd ask some Indian repair, and they would come up with some crazy way,
it's called jugaad.
For 50 rupees of wiring it and making it all work. And that spirit is very present in Chandrayaan, I think.
That's the power of jugaad. Farid Zakaria, it's been an absolute pleasure. There are no easy answers to any of the questions that are thrown at you. You've done as only you can, shed light on these hot button global issues, sharing your time and insights with us. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us in India.
Always a pleasure, Rahul. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much.